Hello gardeners, welcome to Native Plant Channel, and here I'm so excited to be at Mount Cuba today in Delaware with Caroline Pacini, and Caroline is Assistant Manager of Interpretation here at Mount Cuba. We have such an exciting day planned for you where we're going to take you on a tour, show you the many plants here, and then we're also going to check out the trial gardens. So you're in store for a great day today. Caroline, will you please tell us a little bit about Mount Cuba's history?
Of course. So Mount Cuba Center is the former home and gardens of Lamont DuPont Copeland and Pamela Cunningham Copeland. And the Copelands moved to Delaware in 1935, and when they were sort of scouting out a site to build their family home, Mrs. Copeland was really interested in looking for a hill. So she fell in love with this particular site because of the hill behind us. And she actually grew up in Litchfield, Connecticut, so she was really used to the New England hills and wanted to kind of find something that reminded her of where she grew up. So she was lucky enough to find the only hill in Delaware. We have it right here. So they bought the property in 1935, started construction on the house, and moved in 1937. And then shortly after, got to work on their gardens. So they started developing the gardens directly surrounding the house first, which are our formal gardens, where we'll go first. And then in like 1950, they purchased some adjoining property to develop their naturalistic gardens, and we'll actually go in there later. And it's hard to believe, but when they bought the property, it was just fallow farmland. So I say that that's hard to believe because obviously we're standing in like a lush, green, ecologically thriving garden today. So if that gives you any sense of the vision that they had for this place and how it's come to be now. But anyways, in the about 50 years that they lived here after they moved in, they became really prominent figures in the local gardening and conservation circles. And also their love for gardening and their understanding and knowledge of native plants really grew and evolved too. And so it was that knowledge, specifically Mrs. Copeland's knowledge and vision for this place, that provided the sort of baseline for what Mount Cuba's mission is today, which is to inspire an appreciation for the beauty and value of native plants and a commitment to protect the habitats that sustain them. And so at Mount Cuba Center, our living collections are focused on native plants that are native to the eastern temperate forests of the United States, but we have a particular emphasis on the Appalachian Piedmont ecoregion, which extends all the way from New Jersey down to Alabama. Or Mr. and Mrs. Copeland's vision for this place was really, they always wanted it to be a place where people would come and be inspired to be conservators, which is what happened to them, in the course of the time that they lived here. And so 2001, Mrs. Copeland passed away and the transition to public garden began. In 2013, we opened to the public for general admission, and since then we've just been growing ever since. And now we have a really robust continuing education program. We have our trial garden, which you'll see later. And we have, if I do say so myself, a packed and very exciting schedule of seasonal events, which is what I do at Mount Cuba. One of our most popular events actually happens in this area. It's called Twilight on the Terrace. Happens once a month from May through September. And we have live music out here. People just sit on the lawn and relax. We have food trucks and everything. And I just bring that up because Mount Cuba is not only a place for advanced gardeners. If you're just someone who likes to connect with nature and be outside, Mount Cuba is for you too. Of course, our hope is that eventually you will be inspired to take action in some way and plant a native plant or take a class or something. But we really welcome people of all levels of interest and all native plant enthusiasts as well.
If you're at home and thinking about ground covers, Caroline, can you tell us about what's happening here?
Yes, so we actually have this great native Pachysandra. It's called Allegheny Pachysandra. Scientific name is Pachysandra procumbens. A lot of people are surprised to know that we have a native Pachysandra because I think a lot of people are used to planting the Japanese one. This is a great option for shady areas. It does really well, makes this really nice thick carpet. In the spring too, it puts up these little white flowers that smell so sweet. When you're out here, it just smells like heavenly. It's kind of a clove scent. So they're a really great option to plant instead of the Japanese Pachysandra. And then we also have these beautiful containers that are done by our formal gardens horticulturalist Donna. And so these are Heuchera hybrid, and you can see they're blooming right now. Also a great ground cover, but you can see they do well in containers too. And the containers actually are kept pretty minimal on this part of the terrace so as not to obstruct the view, which is kind of an interesting aesthetic choice. So before we leave the main terrace area, we always like to highlight this hedge right here. And you might be like, why do I care about this hedge? Let me tell you. So this hedge used to be Japanese barberry, which if you're not familiar is an invasive plant. And in 2003, I believe, we actually switched out the Japanese barberry for this native Itea virginica cultivar Henry's Garnet. It's called Henry's Garnet because it puts on really like stunning fall foliage. It gets this bright red in the fall. And we like to highlight this because it's a really good example of a concept that we talk about a lot at Mount Cuba called conservation by addition, which is just the idea that people can switch out non-native plants for native plants at a pace that's manageable for them. So if you, for instance, can't switch out an entire hedge like all at once, just even adding one native plant at a time is making a positive impact on your broader environment. Another really interesting feature that we have on the main terrace are these two trees. So these are actually willow oaks, Quercus phellos. And these oak trees were put in when the Copelands were still living here. And that's because the Copelands used to come out onto the terrace and eat their breakfast, enjoy this beautiful view, but at some point they decided that they needed shade while they were doing those things. So to get instant shade, as you can imagine, you need trees of a certain size. And so these trees, at the time when they were brought in, were big enough that they had to be airlifted by a helicopter. So these trees were brought in by helicopter and have been here ever since.
All right, and if you are gardening in a small area or an urban area, here are some thoughts for you.
Yes, so like Lourdes said, container gardens are a great option for people working with a little bit of space, or if you don't have like an enormous garden to work with, these are a really great option for you. We have a lot of very beautiful native containers decorating where we are right now, which is the South Garden. In this one we have some different heucheras, we have Aquilegia canadensis, moss phlox, and then in the back, you can't see it here, but Polemonium reptans or Jacob's ladder. So these are just a good way to make an impact on a small scale, right? Because if you're living maybe in a city and you just have a little terrace and you want to have some native containers, you're still supporting pollinators, so it's a win-win for everyone. So here we are in our South Garden. The South Garden was designed by a landscape architect named Marion Coffin in 1945 to 1950, and Marion Coffin was a female landscape architect when there weren't a lot of them, which is significant because at Mount Cuba we have a really great legacy of some strong, successful and intelligent women who contributed to the sort of genesis of the gardens. Obviously we have our founder, Pamela Copeland, then we have Marion Coffin. But anyways, so the original plan for the South Garden was a combination of non-natives and natives. And in 2015, another example of conservation by addition, we did a big South Garden renovation where a lot of those non-natives got swapped out for natives. So now this garden really serves as an example for home gardeners of how native plants can work in a formal landscape setting. So if you're working with these similar conditions, hot, dry, some hardscaping around, this is a place where you can come and take inspiration for your own garden by looking at our plant combinations. This garden is also designed for constant seasonal interest, so you can come any time of year to be inspired.
So here we're going to go down the garden walk and take a look at some of the plants here.
Yep, so first up is Tradescantia. This is a type of spiderwort. Next up we have Valerie finis mugwort. This is a kind of nice swap for lamb's ear. It has that same soft texture. Then we have Baptisia, and this is a cultivar lemon meringue. The name comes from those yellow blooms. And then a nice Amsonia that's already blooming. And here's that pink profusion Bowman's root with some blue-eyed grass in front of it, which is definitely a favorite of our guests. So what we're looking at here is plantain leaf sedge, or Carex plantagenea. You can see they've planted it in this really kind of neat way to form a sedge carpet almost, and it does well in the shade. But this plant is a good option if you're looking to add some texture to your garden. One of the other common names for this plant is seersucker sedge because the leaves actually have a texture similar to seersucker fabric. So what you're looking at is a white oak tree, Quercus alba, And this tree is special to Mount Cuba for a couple of reasons. One being that this tree was given to Mrs. Copeland for her 90th birthday present by her grandkids. So that makes it special in itself. But then the other story behind this tree is that it's actually the descendant of what used to be the largest white oak tree in the United States up until 2002. So we also call this tree the Y oak, W-Y-E, because it is the progeny of the original Y oak, which was living in Y Mills, Maryland, for over 400 years until 2002 when a big storm came and knocked it down. But apparently that original Y oak, the main trunk of it was like over 61,000 pounds or something. It was big. Our tree's not that big, but it does have that big of a meaning and like legacy to Mount Cuba. And it's a good reason to talk about how plants can carry memories for people, and you can make memories like with plants. I think a lot of people can relate to that. So we like this tree, and now we have things like story time underneath of it. We're helping people make memories of their own with it.
Yes, that's amazing. And you know, as gardeners, we all do have some special plants in our garden that were given to us by a loved one or a special friend that we all cherish.
So now we're on the woods path. And this is one of our naturalistic garden spaces, so you can already tell the sort of difference in how it looks and how things are planted from the formal gardens that we visited earlier. And so naturalistic, you can kind of tell from the name. Naturalistic gardens are ones that mimic patterns or plant combinations or just the general look and feel of a natural woodland. So that's very much what the gardeners who maintain this area are thinking about when they're designing plant combinations. They approach it very much the same way that an artist might compose a painting. They're thinking about texture and color and scale and layering, which I think is very evident when you look at how beautiful all of these beds are. One of the most iconic features of the woods path are our tulip trees, Liriodendron tulipifera. And some of these tulip trees actually predate the Copelands moving onto the property, but once they did move onto the property and started developing their naturalistic gardens, they planted more of these tulip trees to sort of emphasize the effect that you're seeing right now, which was something that they referred to as a cathedral effect, which just means that, you know, they're really drawing on the verticality of the trunks. They actually limbed them up to emphasize that. And sometimes on really sunny days, the way that the light filters through the leaves is reminiscent of the way light goes through stained glass windows. And we actually have some really awesome quotes from Mrs. Copeland talking about this, because it was all super intentional. She talked about how when people are in gardens, they're always looking down because that's where the plants are, right? So it makes sense. But she said, you know, if you look up, there's actually so much to see up there. So this was her sort of attempt at getting people to look up in the garden. And speaking of looking up, if you were walking along the woods path, you might notice this big snag here that we've left standing in the garden. And so our arboriculture team, if we lose trees due to storm damage or something like that, or we have some stumps left over from dead trees, as long as it's safe, they will actually leave them standing. And that's because these trees are a great source of habitat and shelter for anything that is a cavity dweller. So, and you'll actually notice up at the top, I don't know if you can see it from here, but the arborists have also done a coronet cut, so they've cut the top of it to look more natural and even drilled a few holes in there to get some wildlife started. So we have a couple plants blooming in this area, all purple right now. We have the dwarf-crested iris, Iris cristata. A lot of gardeners aren't familiar with this one, but it's a really great option for a smaller iris. Obviously, it's a dwarf. And then right next to it we have Phlox divaricata growing, or woodland phlox. It's got a nice effect because it almost looks like a little cloud of mist, like kind of floating above the rest of the things in the garden.
Yes, and those are two wonderful ground cover choices for somebody looking for something in the shade and low growing. Some other low growing ground cover choices for shade are this beautiful wild geranium, which holds its flowers above the leaves. And take a look at this foam flower. You have the white frothy flowers that really brighten everything up. And here you see it with a yellow trillium. This one is rue anemone that just has these dainty white flowers. Such a pretty little plant and very low. And here is a white trillium. Trilliums just have such a fantastic array of gorgeous flowers, and they come in various colors as well. Just lovely for the woodland garden. And some, like this one, have beautiful patterns on their leaves as well. Our native columbine, such beautiful flowers with an interesting yellow in the center. You know, you really have to take a good look at the flowers to see just how beautiful they are. Only the red one is native to the eastern United States. Any other color is not native. And Mount Cuba has these gorgeous yellow lady slippers. Oh my goodness, you'll find them tucked in here and there. They are absolutely stunning.
So the last thing that we're going to talk about today is ecological gardening or eco-gardening. Eco-gardening is a concept that's very important to Mount Cuba Center because it's basically an approach that considers the fact that we're all part of an interconnected ecosystem. So the choices that we make in our own landscapes and in our own gardens can be positive ones to the ecosystem at large, right? And so we do that in a variety of different ways. Like, we carry that mindset with us here at Mount Cuba in a lot of different ways. And I'm going to give 4 examples today of how you can use eco-gardening techniques, the same ones that we do at home. So the first one, this shouldn't be a surprise probably at this point, is plant native plants. So this is one of the best things you can do. Native plants form the base of the food web. They've co-evolved with local flora and fauna over millennia, so they're often best suited to regional conditions and best suited to support local wildlife. And so, like we said before, planting even one native plant at a time is going to make a positive change. The second thing is composting. At Mount Cuba Center in 2013, we implemented a multi-pronged composting program. So we take waste from our gardens, grounds, greenhouse, and kitchen, and we turn it into usable compost and apply it to the gardens as compost or compost tea. And that compost keeps our gardens healthy all year round. The third thing is leaf mulch. At Mount Cuba, leaf mulching is actually our primary mulching system. So we collect fallen leaves from the ground, we chop them up, shred them, let them decompose for a bit, and then reapply them to our garden beds. And they return all of these really beneficial nutrients to the soil and keep it healthy. And as a home gardener, this is something that will actually save you a step. You can, instead of raking your leaves, putting them in a bag, and then putting them on your curb, you can just rake them into a bed and chop them up a little bit. And it creates leaf litter, which creates habitat for things like salamanders and other wildlife, but it saves you a step. And so the last technique I'll mention is gardening for wildlife. And you can garden for wildlife in a lot of different ways, but I'm just going to mention 3 of them. One, and this is pretty easy, is just planting pollinator plants. So planting the things that you know are going to support native bees and butterflies. The second one is by leaving seed heads standing. So if you have some echinacea that is spent at the end of your season, instead of cutting that back, leave it up because the birds are going to use those seeds. And then the very last thing that you can do is actually create a wildlife brush pile. So again, if you're gardening and you have some extra sticks and brush that you would just regularly throw out, instead put it into a little pile in the back of your yard, and that's going to provide shelter and food for insects, rodents, and birds. And I was actually talking to my friend about brush piles the other day, and she was saying, I do that anyways, and I just thought it was because I was lazy. And I was like, no, it's actually really helpful for wildlife, and she didn't even know. So that's just another example. But those are just some of the eco-gardening techniques that we use at Mount Cuba that I think are pretty easily applied at home as well. And if you're interested in learning more about ecological gardening, Mount Cuba Center offers an eco-gardening certificate. So you take a curriculum of classes and you come out of it an eco-gardener.
So Caroline, I want to thank you. Our tour and our day is not over yet. We're going to be headed to the trial gardens, but you've done such a fabulous job of explaining what's happening at Mount Cuba, about the many plants and the history. So I want to thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Friends, there's so much more to learn as we visit the trial garden, and Sam Hoadley tells us all about how different native plants have performed. So please click for Tour of Mount Cuba Part 2.